Following the release of Halo 3 in 2007, Bungie Studios made plans to separate from Microsoft to become an independent company. The rights to the Halo franchise, however, would stay with Microsoft. While Bungie continued to work with Microsoft on spin-off games in the series over the following years, Microsoft began building a studio of their own to continue Halo. This is the story of how 343 Industries built a game and a studio at once.
I think the fundamental difference between Bungie and 343 is the way that they were formed. They're very, very different. Bungie formed very naturally, very organically as a small studio, building really small experiences, and grew into those big shoes and grew into Halo, and they grew up with each other. And so it's a very, definitely felt like a family.
We were basically being asked to build a brand new studio from scratch, take over one of the most beloved gaming IPs that's out there, take it over from one of the most celebrated developers in our industry in Bungie. And in addition to that, we'd be quietly building our next chapter in the Halo saga, Halo 4.
343 Industries wouldn't just be a game developer. They would be the studio for everything Halo. Over the years, Halo had amassed a large extended universe through other forms of media, and 343 would be managing it all.
Everything that we make in that franchise, whether it's a comic book, whether it's a novel, whether even action figures, every single story that we're telling is feeding the game. Everything pours into the game eventually.
That was the philosophy that 343 took regarding Halo's transmedia. The studio would unite the franchise's external media under a shared vision that informed and shaped their games, and vice versa.
It's something that influences everything that we do, and that's the belief in the power of storytelling.
Halo had countless stories waiting to be told, and at the heart of every great story is emotion. This would be the guiding principle for 343 Industries as they took over the Halo universe. However, building a team of people to tell that story would prove to be a challenge.
How do we find that sort of deep talent who also has a collaborative spirit and, I would say, a craftsman approach, and of course passion, not just for what Halo has been, but also for what it could be.
The studio would soon find its creative director in Ryan Payton, who had previously worked for Kojima Productions on the Metal Gear series. Payton came onto the project with big ideas and wanted to innovate on the Halo formula in the same way Bungie had before.
One of the biggest challenges is when you work on a big franchise is innovation. And I really believe that we're just getting started as an industry, so I feel like the rules haven't been set yet. So why not go and try to go in different directions?
Bringing in his Metal Gear sensibilities, he had a goal of expanding Halo beyond the traditional FPS. In fact, Payton said that he wanted Halo 4 to be so different, it was unrecognizable as a sequel to Halo 3.
I think with large franchises, though, that's a huge challenge when you have literally hundreds of millions, sometimes $1 billion on the line.
Among some of Payton's ideas were weapons down missions, an idea that would later be executed in Halo 5 Guardians, but saw less than stellar reception from the team of Halo 4. As time grew on, confidence in Payton's vision wavered. In 2011, after 3 years on a project, Payton would be demoted from creative director to narrative designer, no longer managing the team.
I think the game that I was trying to make was the wrong game for a new team. It was a lot riskier, I think.
After being demoted, Payton would exit 343 Industries and Josh Holmes would take his place. Ultimately, Holmes wanted to take Halo's story in a similar direction as Payton, but needed to make it something actually achievable. Before Payton's departure, the team working on Halo 4, at the time codenamed Midnight, were already underway making solid progress on the game, including reworking Master Chief and Cortana to tell this new story.
It's interesting, early on we talked about the hero's journey, and like, how do you have a hero's journey when he's already a hero? Where does he still need to go as a human?
While the game's writer, Chris Schlurf, continued to bring out the Master Chief's humanity in the game's narrative, artists worked to fully realize that humanity by redesigning his armor, an endeavor the team was particularly excited for.
For us, it's making him feel like a real person. We have a nude male sculpt, and then from there we sculpted on physically a tech suit.
Afforded a large budget because he's the main character, the team drew inspiration from tanks and fighter jets and meticulously detailed his new armor set.
Fingers are missing here on these. They have armor caps that come on, But he doesn't have armor caps on his trigger finger or thumb finger so that he could have more tactile sense when he's shooting and loading his weaponry. The last thing we just changed was his visor. His visor picks up the elements based on the room that he's in.
We want to take every inch of the character to tell a story as much as we can.
For the first time in the series, the characters would be brought to life through motion capture technology. Bruce Thomas was cast for the role because of his physicality, bringing to life the newly defined Master Chief.
At the beginning of Halo 4, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. And, over the course of the production of the game, I watched her deteriorate as a human being and become someone that I couldn't even recognize. And, that was really hard, but it was also an inspiration to me to want to tell Cortana's story.
Concept artists were encouraged to explore a multitude of ideas for Cortana's new look, with her rampancy in mind. In order to fully convey the emotions needed, her in-game model would need to be very expressive.
How can we see these subtle details in her facial structure? So this is the baseline where we started for Cortana, and then we go through and tweak and modify, having all these different elements moving throughout her that make her feel alive constantly.
And just like with Master Chief, great attention would be paid to the details.
We wanted to make it to where you could have code flow lines start from every digit from her toes to her hands, and then be able to flow all the way up into her head.
Just making her boobs so big, I think made everybody a little nervous, but it was definitely interesting seeing myself and then looking on the screen and then seeing a nice big naked blue chick.
Mackenzie Mason was chosen as Cortana's mocap actor because she was capable of bringing both an innocence and a fierceness to the role. Cortana and Master Chief weren't the only ones to be redesigned. Much of the Halo universe would receive a facelift to make the most out of new technology.
The art direction specifically for Halo 4 isn't about creating an emotional tone for Halo 4, it's about creating an emotional tone for every single moment and experience that the player needs to understand.
Artists and designers weren't just working on revitalizing the familiar, but also the brand new, including Halo 4's new enemy faction, the Prometheans.
We wanted to sort of combine familiar and alien. We wanted to have the characters all cooperate with one another so that they sort of demonstrated some level of intelligence, of working together, adapt their form and environment to whatever they needed to do tactically in order to defeat their enemy.
With these goals in mind, concepts would be drawn up and prototypes would be put together. The team planned for 6 new enemies, and they found early success after prototyping a flying unit, which would eventually become the Watcher. The next focus would be the main enemy combatant and equivalent to the Elite, the Knight. A very early prototype would see the Knight move around by condensing itself into a ball. But work on the Prometheans would prove to be a long, arduous journey for the team. We'll get back to that in a bit, because designing the Prometheans was only one part of their story. Early on, 343 approached acclaimed sci-fi author Greg Bear to work on a trilogy of books fleshing out the history of the Forerunners. He had countless science fiction novels under his belt, but it was his recent book, City at the End of Time, that caught their attention.
What I hear is that after they read that book, they says, I think this guy could do the Halo stories. We could do the Forerunner thing, which was kind of perilous because not only was Microsoft taking over, but the game was coming up and they had to figure this was going to be their first big game. So playing around this way is kind of courageous or foolish, I'm not sure which.
With the help of his daughter, Chloe, and back and forth communication from the studio, Greg Bear would start writing a new trilogy of books that were intertwined with the events and characters of Halo 4, showing 343's transmedia approach in action. While many of the game's development secrets would go unrevealed for years, Xbox 360 development kits would eventually be leaked, and with them, early builds of Halo 4. In combination with developer conferences, we can learn a lot about the way this game changed over time. The game's first level, Dawn, is a perfect example of the many incremental changes that build up during development. Originally, there were no encounters with the Covenant prior to activating the Observation Deck's console. Chief and Cortana would not only see Covenant ships, but also the Forerunner planet opening.
Okay, so I think we have a problem.
Covenant.
Which is what would be the trigger for Phantoms to breach the forward onto Dawn. This proved to be overwhelming for the player, so these events were spaced out. Instead of firing a missile, the players would launch a beacon.
Yes, beacon away!
The level would end with the player reaching the escape pods, before the ship crumbles, forcing the player to navigate space with their jetpack in a sequence where they have to follow the pod. In the escape pod, the duo would crash on the planet, which at this time was called Haven. Much of the second level's geometry is vastly different from what would ship in the final game, as well as certain narrative beats.
It's performing some kind of combat capability scan. It's checking you, your armor, denied, even me.
In Forerunner, which was called Cryptum at the time, the designers had trouble portraying the curvature of the planet, and portaling around without a frame of reference confused players. So a main area was created to overlook everywhere the players would end up, which you see reflected in the transit hub in the final game. And it would be heavily implied that the didact we encounter in-game was the one who fired the Halo rings. Along with some radically different level geometry, including an interior structure with Marines, Infinity was planned to have a cutscene where Sarah Palmer and other Spartan 4s would arrive in a Pelican to save Chief from some Promethean Knights. Shutdown's ending had the player jumping across liches and fighting their occupants in-game instead of a cutscene. And Composer originally opened up with a sequence where you take over the lich and defend it from enemy ships in the space around Ivanov Station, all of which would eventually be shortened into its opening cutscene. The game's final level would see some drastic changes too. Traversing the Didact starship, the player would come across an area where they would witness the creation of a Promethean Knight. Many of these changes are natural for game development, as the developers learn what does and doesn't work. Not everything, however, would go as expected.
A simple beast, adorned in a primitive combat skin?
In February of 2012, David Anthony Pizzuto, who was cast to play the Didact, would pass away. This wouldn't be the only setback that the new Forerunner faction would face. The Promethean Knight alone had gone through several redesigns, one of which featured an AI trapped inside of its carapace. Attempt after attempt didn't bring the team any closer to something they liked. The difficulty in creating the Knight had already caused the 6 proposed enemy units to be reduced to 3, but without a clear goal defined, the team still had trouble finding an identity for the enemies.
What we found was, we would go down a path with mechanics and then discover, now we've introduced a behavior that doesn't make sense with some of the established fiction. Or we would go down a path with visuals and we would say, this is a cool looking character, but it doesn't support the gameplay needs that we have for this character mechanically.
Along with the Prometheans came a new set of weapons, but the team originally crafted these weapons with a deep sci-fi appearance, and the weapons functioned in ways that other guns in the Halo sandbox hadn't, which proved to be alienating to playtesters.
They would just toss them aside and use the Covenant weapons or the UNSC weapons and just sort of forget about these new ones, which really sucks when you're making new weapons and nobody wants to use them.
But the problems with Prometheans and their guns weren't the only thing complicating matters for the studio.
Chris was having a crisis of confidence. He was literally tearing his hair out because, he didn't know how to tell this story. And there were times when, he came to me and he said, maybe we shouldn't do it.
I can't. I just can't stop them. It's like 1,000 of me arguing all at once.
Halo 4's new focus on telling an emotionally resonant story proved to be particularly challenging for Chris Schlurf and the narrative team. After all, this was a first-person shooter, and one still generally following the formula Halo had laid down in the past. These problems were only compounded by 343's infancy as a studio.
There's the fact that we built a studio and made a game at the same time. That's pretty crazy if you actually knew what that entailed.
As a brand new studio, 343 was still finding themselves, adding new employees to their team, and learning to use the tools left behind by Bungie.
Brought in these amazing, talented people to make a game that would never worked together before. They're working with new ingredients in the kitchen they're not familiar with, and so there was kind of a craziness that came about from all that.
The Halo engine's a very technical engineering focused engine. It's super hard for creatives to work in. It's super hard for a lot of creatives to work in. You can only do so much on that engine.
In Halo 4, we had some really big missions, really expansive spaces, and we'd often have performance issues in these areas. We had some very complicated characters. We also had times where we were spawning in way too many dynamic objects and or AI.
The Watcher often encourages that one-dimensional approach to these encounters, which we saw develop over time through user research and our own playtesting. We knew it would be a problem. More than one occasion, the feedback we'd get from our playtesters that are user researchers, they call him little fucker.
We had our ship date kind of coming in, and there was lots of performance to do, and there was not a lot of time.
The bar was so high, and nobody believed that we could do it, and so it was kind of up to us to prove everybody wrong.
Despite the trouble, development would march on, and the game would come closer and closer to its finished state. The team would finalize their Promethean Knight design and mechanics, and they would find a solution to their weapons by making them Forerunner counterparts to human weapons that players would already be experienced with.
And as soon as we went down that path, we saw players understanding how to use these weapons. They became much more popular, and mission accomplished with that.
Concerns over the story waned, especially when Steve Downes and Jen Taylor entered the studio to record their lines. Prior to Halo 4, the two had never even recorded in the same room together. The Didact would find his voice in Keith Sarabaika, filling the role left after David Anthony Pizzuto's passing.
They allowed me to watch some of the voice actors doing their voices. That was a fascinating thing, to watch my character, as I described it on the book, being given life.
In late September, the game went gold, meaning production had finally finished. 343 had pulled off a Herculean task of building a game and a studio all at once, and the release date was fast approaching. On November 6, 2012, Halo 4 launched, and with it, a mix of different opinions. Commercially, it broke records for the franchise, having the best opening week of any Halo game. Critically, the game performed very well, and it comfortably sits at an 87 on Metacritic, signifying generally favorable reviews. IGN even called it the best Halo game to date. Reception from some hardcore fans, however, would be less than stellar. To these fans, Halo 4 was a radical departure from what came before it. The game's art design in particular was heavily criticized by many in the fanbase, who thought it strayed too far from the series' identity. By the release of Halo Infinite in 2021, 343 would backtrack on these designs, including resetting the Master Chief and Cortana to designs that evoke their earlier appearances. The Prometheans, which the team spent so much time developing, would not be met with a warm welcome. The problem with the Watchers making encounters one-dimensional wasn't sorted out before release, and many complained that the Knights were bullet sponges with overly complicated designs. Many found the main story involving the game's antagonist, the Didact, to be confusing, feeling like they were missing context from the Forerunner trilogy of books if they didn't read it. Because of this, the Didact would never appear in the games again. But for others, Halo 4 was something special. Halo 4 was an experiment in transmedia, uniting an intertwined web of converging narratives that pushed the Halo universe in a single direction. For fans tapped into it, it was an exciting and rewarding time. Whether you think it's for better or for worse, there will never be another game quite like Halo 4.